Sure. Hi, folks. Locke Fraser here. Welcome to the Environmental Science Seminar Series. We are nearing the end, but there are still two more excellent seminars to go. And I just want to remind you who is going to be coming next to TRU. Next week, March 21st, we have Dr. Nancy Turner from UVic. And the title of her talk is Wild Cultivation, Traditional Tending of Plants and Their Habitats in Northwestern North America. This will be a real treat. Nancy Turner is a world-renowned ethnobotanist, and she's emeritus right now at UVic. So I encourage you all to come and come to that talk. And then the last presentation is March 28th, and that's Jordan Koch from McGill University. And I'm going to read this as it comes. Street hockey, dispatches from the front lines of Canada's new urban sporting environment, and it kind of reminds me actually of a CBC show I heard last year about a fellow who was traveling across Canada and visiting local hockey rinks and sort of making that connection. I wonder if this is the same guy. I don't know. Anyway, that sounds really interesting. Hopefully, our weather will have improved enough that we won't need to be playing ice hockey outside. So today, I get to introduce our speaker from UBC Okanagan, John Wagner. John's an associate professor in anthropology at UBCO. John is an environmental anthropologist who's done really interesting work with water governance, agriculture and food security, and diverse aspects of his research and also include language documentation in Papua New Guinea. He's published widely. Most recently, he edited a book, Island Rivers, Fresh Water and Place in Oceania. Today, he's presenting his research on restoration and flooding in the Kelowna floodplain. So, please join me in welcoming John Wagner.
Okay. Thank you, Lachlan. It's a real pleasure to be here. First time I've ever been to TRU in any kind of professional capacity. My daughter was a student here before it was TRU, actually. But especially to be a speaker in a series with such illustrious company as Nancy Turner, who I did my BA and my MA at UVic, so I got to know Nancy when she was there, actually, and had a chance to see her just not that many weeks ago, actually, when she was in Kelowna giving a presentation as well. And curiously enough, I did my PhD at McGill, so I feel in good company. Am I positioning right for the YouTube stream? Should I? Yeah. Your camera is right there. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Just give me a wave if I get out of place. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, in praise of floods. So I should start with a disclaimer. I'm not praising floods for when they cause loss of life or property damage, but I'm praising floods for all the wonderful things they do when they're allowed to happen, either in natural or, let's say, a naturalized way in terms of the environmental benefits. So speaking particularly to the Kelowna experience with flooding over the last couple of years, the research I'm going to describe today is actually a collaborative project, and it's being done with a lot of people in the Waterways Project at UBC Okanagan. And the Waterways Project is actually being led by a media artist, Alex Dulich. And the outcome of this research is going to be a public exhibition about water issues in the Okanagan, about Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous relationships to water, about ways we could work better together to manage water issues, especially in this case. I'm just chewing off one little piece of the Waterways Project to focus on the floodplain issue in Kelowna, which I didn't realize we had a floodplain until not that long ago. I've done research in the Okanagan and in the Columbia Basin, but my previous research in the Okanagan was focused a little more on water and agriculture, and on a little further south, not on the Kelowna area itself. So the Waterways Project. Okay, so this is the kind of message we're getting today, March 7th, whoops, from one of the local news sources, Castanet. You need to prepare. And the kinds of messages within this particular article, trying to be a little dramatic here, I'm not sure I'm succeeding, but so they're going back to the spring of 2017 and what exactly happened there to scare everybody to death, really, and then floods again in 2018. Emergency operations really had to gear up big time for us those years. You may only have minutes. You better get your emergency kit ready. So these are the kinds of messages that we're getting now as this possible flood season arrives. Doesn't look like we're going to have a flood this year, but we got surprised in the past. So what I want to do today is actually go through what did happen in 2017-18, review a little bit of the history of how we got ourselves into a position of being so vulnerable to floods right down in the city center, and then make a few proposals about what we could do to help get out of that by actually expanding the flood zone. And maybe you had floods here in 2017, 2018 as well. You've got a big river, or apparently more than one. So I'd be happy to hear. I actually don't know much about what happened up here, but happy to hear a bit more about it. So the Okanagan Emergency Response Center basically started coming up with some maps of where we were vulnerable to. And I'm not sure if very many of you know the Kelowna city area very well, but we're looking at Mission Creek here where it empties into Okanagan Lake. Mission Creek is the largest creek that feeds the Okanagan Lake system. So this is, the southeast of Kelowna, and really you can go on a little further to Bellevue Creek and you still got flood zone happening along the foreshore. And you keep going down the coastline, you get to the center, here's the bridge, whoops. The hospital is just down here, and you keep going. It's all flood zone. All the front along the lake is flood zone. So they didn't map out, at least I was not able to find maps like this for the two main creeks I want to talk about, Mission Creek and Mill Creek, which are also flood zones. And they're the ones which, Mill Creek especially, caused a lot of harm in 2017. So what is this all about, really? The climate change is a climate change impact, of course. Why we're so worried now and haven't been before, why we're not that prepared. I'm relying here, Impact Area 1, this comes from the BC Agriculture and Food Climate Action Initiative, and they laid out various impacts from climate change that they should be concerned about, particularly in the agricultural sector. And because I'm interested in agriculture, I've been paying a lot of attention to that. And most of us have been worried in the Okanagan about drought, not about floods. And you can see why. Increasing temperatures, more warm and extremely hot days in summer, less snowpack, however, more rain in the winter, and decreasing precipitation in the summer. But overall, the models have been precipitation is going to stay about the same, or it's going to go up a bit. It seems now people are settling into the idea that, yeah, it's going to go up. Maybe 10% is going to be the average increase in precipitation. So that doesn't sound very bad, right? That doesn't sound like huge flooding scares. But Impact Area 3 is the one that's really concerning for us. And that is what, of course, everybody who's aware of climate change understands is the extreme events, the extreme precipitation, and the likelihood that extreme precipitation events will be happening more often, not once every 200 years, but much more often than that. So that's what happened. Let's go through what actually happened in 2017. So the winter was actually drier and colder than usual. The snowpack by the beginning of March was only about 80% of normal. The people who managed the lake level thought, okay, we're good. We're going to keep a fair amount of water in the lake still for now. They have to balance the level of the lake against multi-use kinds of situation. But then record levels of precipitation from March to May, which came down first as snow. So actually the snowpack by the end of the snow season was way above the average figure, way above the 100% norm. The lake started filling up quite rapidly, and then in May, rains. So rains at lower elevations, but it was also raining at higher elevations. So it was melting the snow. Everything was coming down at once. I happened to be in Papua New Guinea at the time. I couldn't believe the news I was getting. I was in a situation in Papua New Guinea where in a village they had had floods the previous winter that had really devastated some of their gardening areas. And so now, and we had tried to help out. We'd send a bit of emergency funding, and now I was saying, oh, your turn to send us some emergency funding. My home is flooding. So Okanagan experienced the highest May inflow on record. Unusually high. Nobody that I know in the Okanagan had ever seen anything like this around the shore. Many people affected. 23% of the population of Kelowna lives within what we could say is a flood zone area. All the damage, the evacuation orders, the man hours of work to deal with this, the millions of dollars, it affected the economy as well. Just a few of the images. I'm not sure these are perhaps the best ones I could have found, and apologies for not having these properly sourced, but there was a golf course featured on the first slide, and here it is again. These are actually fairly close to the university. This is Mill Creek. I'll show you where Mill Creek is in the watershed in a second. But perhaps even more dramatic was the foreshore. All these rich people with their fancy houses that crowd the rest of us off the beach, push their wharfs and their fence lines right down there. Yeah, we kind of felt bad for them. But they had water in their basements. They were out there sandbagging, in the middle of the night. It was really, really pretty desperate situation to go down to some of the local beaches. There was no beach, and there was no grassy knoll above the beach. It was all underwater. It was really, really amazing. Actually, I'd never expected to see the Okanagan like this, or Kelowna like this. Here's Mill Creek. Mill Creek runs through a lot of agricultural land, so not so much flooding of residential areas from Mission Creek, but a lot of erosion. A lot of places where soils were washed away, and here you see them coming out into the lake. 2018, we had floods again, but not so bad. But what's interesting is that in 2018, the snowpack was huge. It was bigger than 2017. But they were prepared, and it didn't happen all at once. So what happened in 2018 was that they got the lake level down as low as they could early, because they knew they were going to have a lot of melt come down on them, and they were just praying not to have heavy rains as well in May, and we didn't. This graph shows this is not a spike of precipitation. Whoops. This is the cumulative graph, so it shows you by May, well into May, in the spring 2018. What we were dealing with in terms of just really kind of off the scale of normal precipitation levels. But we got away in 2018 with minor flooding here and there. There'd been a lot of work to improve some infrastructure after 2017, and getting the lake level down early. That's what really made this manageable. But still, the creeks were not able really to manage that level of water. So okay, the Kelowna floodplain area, most people who live in Kelowna have no idea there ever was a floodplain there, or a floodplain wanting to happen now. But so here's downtown Kelowna. There's the bridge. University is just out here. So basically, here's the Mission Creek, the big one, which comes down here and loops around and comes out down here. Mill Creek is not so easy to see here. It's not this big one that comes down to Duck Lake, or Allison Lake as it's also known as. It's another slightly smaller one here, but it's very long. And it comes around here, weaves around past the university, and it also comes right very close to Mission Creek, just by Dilworth Mountain, and then it exits just below the bridge here. So those are the two main creeks. There's a number of small creeks, and there's some tributaries to those creeks. But they managed, between the two of them historically, to have turned the whole area really in the circle into floodplain most of the year. We've had members of our team doing reconstructions of what the original creek courses looked like before they got straightened. Mill Creek, Mission Creek has been diked and straightened. It used to meander a lot, although it had some straight courses to it as well. Mill Creek was much more meandering, and now it meanders under the highway through culverts. It escapes to the surface for a little while, goes through somebody's backyard, then it goes through another culvert. Once it gets past the university, basically it gets into industrial areas and then heavily residential areas. It's hard to even find it on a map, but this is what Mill Creek looked like once, a little more, and Mission Creek down here. And see these little blue bars in the center? Those were wetlands. Some of these operated actually like creeks. We don't have a full documentation of them here. You'll see them cropping up on some of the other maps. But really, this whole area was just full of water. If they were not ephemeral wetlands, they were permanent wetlands. Little creeks would just emerge here and run down to the lake because the whole area was so waterlogged. These historic pathways of the water were reconstructed by largely by Catherine Kyle, from the old land grant maps going back to the 1800s. So that's been an interesting process. It's not a perfect science because, well, you can get a date on when the map was drawn, but you can't get a date on when the notes were taken necessarily that led to the maps being drawn. So we can't correct for seasonal change so much with this reconstruction of the creeks, but we're getting a good idea of how they used to look. Here's an example without all the city infrastructure showing. So this is an interesting, now non-existent waterway that used to join Mission Creek and Mill Creek. And it was kind of a permanent fixture. The Dry Creek, they used to call it. It had a few other names as well. It now kind of runs underground to some extent, especially during the wet season. It's funny. In Papua New Guinea, they distinguish between wet season and dry season where I go. And we're kind of starting to do that in the Okanagan now, because those flooding years, especially in 2017, were followed by drought by the end of the summer. And you see these remnants, wetland habitat down there as well. The blue line, the light blue line, shows the current straightened course of the creeks compared to the old, more meandering. Okay, so these are maps that Alex has put together for us. Alex Lake, who's one of the student researchers working on our team. We owe quite a debt of gratitude to Ted Lee, and maybe some of you know the work of Ted Lee, who reconstructed historic change of land cover in the Okanagan environment, and with a lot of focus on Kelowna, actually, which is very good for our project. But Alex is, like Ted Lee, Alex has used aerial photographs from 1938 and more recent ones, but he's also brought in some other data and done a little bit more details in certain ways. And so this shows in the 1800s what a reconstruction of that area on the map with the red circle would have looked like once upon a time. It's all wetland, all wetland. And look at the snakes of waterways here in the middle. You know, there's a mall around here that we have descriptions of as muskrat territory. You hardly see a muskrat anymore. Well, you do see a few, but so much habitat has been lost. And so this is the legend here. Mostly this was either the water birch, red osier dogwood, or it was cottonwood dogwood habitat. Just tons of it. And you can just imagine what would have been living in this kind of habitat. 1938, when we have the aerials to compare, and we know for sure we're not projecting anymore, that's all that's left. Interestingly enough, these are all still showing up, all these waterways. You know what Kelowna did with its little wetlands? Probably the same thing happened here, maybe not. It's happened in a lot of communities. Wetlands were garbage dumps. Because when you were looking for a place, for landfill, you'd go to the lowest part of the environment and fill it up and then dump dirt over it and then use it for housing or something. So the low areas, of course, are the areas that have water. All the wetlands were filled in. A lot of them were filled in for landfill sites. So this is what it looked in 38, and this is what it looks like today. Like the water birch is pretty much all gone. You get a couple little fragments. There's a little more of the cottonwood actually, but it's still in the tiny fragments. Hardly get any of those habitats along Mill Creek anymore. Okanagan is one of the, there's more endangered species in the Okanagan than any place else in British Columbia, right? And so this is one of the reasons. We've also lost a lot of species from our grasslands that have been huge development on the grasslands. But the loss of wetlands has also been a huge hit for the environment. So how did we get there? How did we get into so much trouble? Why did we end up with such a denuded environment? And what hope do we have of ever bringing back some of it? Not just for flood mitigation, but for the environmental benefits that it could bring. So it was Syilx territory to begin with, the indigenous people of the Okanagan, the Syilx people. We have Syilx colleagues working on this project with us, and eventually they will bring more documentation to bear on this particular project in Kelowna. I don't have that information yet. But first settlement in Kelowna was a missionary settlement in 1858. So we get the slow progression of settlers coming in. What are they going to do? They're living in a wetland. They settle beside the river, but far enough back from it that they're not getting flooded in the spring. The bridges are the first thing you have to do. And then they start with the dams, first just a wing dam. Around this time, just in the early settlement period, was when the first reserve in this area was, when the reserves were assigned. And there's one that butts right up against some of the early settlement areas, right beside the mission. 1884, from one of the early settlers, a quote from something he wrote. Across the creek, close to the Indian reservation, there was land available for preemption, wet, boggy, covered in a thick covering of weeds and water plants, but with adjacent stands of timber and rich forest soil. So you can see what was going on here. Rich forest soil, of course, alluvial sediments over hundreds of years, longer than that. You get rid of the timber and make sure there isn't too much water, and you've got great agricultural land. And the mission folks did everything they could to bring settlers in, to settle around them, right beside the Indian Reserve. If you walk along the linear park along Mission Creek today, you'll see some acknowledgement of the early Syilx presence there. This seriously needs some updating and better information added to it, but at least it's there. Okay, early descriptions. I should actually have set my my notes up a little differently because I'm going to have to read from the screen. I can't actually read from my notes, and I'm not going to mess with the technology right now. But some of these early descriptions from people who were around in the early 1900s or not that much later, these were published in the Okanagan Historical Quarterly. And they're really quite vivid. Rolling hills and flats covered with waving bunch grass and grazing thereon hundreds of horses, cattle, and wild game. These were among the early recollections of William Brent. Born at Okanagan Mission in 1873, he could tell of deer and caribou which abounded. The small lakes and swamps were filled with ducks and geese, and the fields were filled with flocks of prairie chickens, sandbills, cranes, birds of all kind, too numerous to mention. His record is that the lakes and creeks were filled with all kinds and sizes of trout, and also on the land were many kinds and sizes of roots and herbs which were dried by the natives for their winter living. Just to try to give you a really as vivid an understanding as possible of what was once there. And this is one that is even perhaps a little more evocative, by a woman, Elisa Swalwell, whose mother was Indigenous, whose father was non-Indigenous. I forget his background. But so she really brought together the Indigenous knowledge to some extent with the settler way of life. It was nice to ride over the range in the morning and see the bunch grass, sunflowers, and lupins springing up so abundantly, and to feel your horse springing under you at every step. There were no fences in those days, and the bunch grass grew so high it waved in the wind like a field of wheat. This is something that keeps cropping up with the grasslands. You never see it today. They seem, even where it's mostly the native grasses in a particular habitat, you know, they're like this. To me, it was an exquisite pleasure as a girl to ride over this green and gracious pasture land in the mornings and to see it stretching before me for miles with the sand rows lying scattered on the ground as if a fairy princess had passed that way at dawn and children had strewn flowers in her path, and to see the sunlight on the hills. On such occasions, I have sometimes seen things, or rather sensed something so serene and beautiful that it left me weak and weeping as I sat in the saddle. It was brings me to tears sometimes just actually reading this. So here we go. We're just going to roll through. You know, you can imagine how this goes. I'm just going to up to 1909. So by 1909, the settlers had moved in very nicely. They'd taken over a lot of the wetland. They had had a reasonably good weather couple of decades, but then they started getting some serious floods in the first decade of the 1900s. And this is when they began to bring in the hard infrastructure that we have today to protect us against floods, at least up until climate change. This is what the town site looked like in 1905. Little pioneer town. Widdop's Pond. If any of you go to the hockey games at Prospera Place from time to time, this is where Prospera Place is now. I tried to get a picture of Prospera Place. I couldn't do it with my own camera. I had to use Google to try to get the orientation and the elevation to show you the mountains across the way. But this is what it looks like there today. It's, you know, all these areas have been totally filled in. We're very close to the waterfront here. That's Prospera Place, rather flattened out, but you can see right behind it, it's all built up. Bernard Street, regularly flooded. This is the area of the Dry Creek, or the that creek that joins Mill Creek and Mission Creek, what that looked like in a typical spring. And look at all the forest still. Benvulen, very near where I live, Mission Creek would flood this on a regular basis. I'm not sure where this one was taken, but this would be not so much directly in the wetlands as you're just trying to get out of the wetland area now, but it's still an area where in the spring you'd get these ephemeral wetlands, which are so important, the ephemeral wetlands, to migratory bird species, spadefoot toad, a lot of species in the Okanagan. Here's Mill Creek, the mouth of Mill Creek in 1957. Now, I should have a today picture to compare this, but what's stunning about this for anybody who lives in Kelowna is all the forest that's still here. This is just house after house after house after house after grassy lawn today. That's just 1957. So now what? What are we going to do now that we're in a climate change regime with all these flooding scares and risk and loss of property and so forth? So there's a number of strategies, a lot of which or all of which will be in play in the coming years. So basically, the hard infrastructure, right? Expand the dikes, dredging, culverts. We could build more dams and larger storage facilities in the upper watersheds as well to protect ourselves from the sudden deluge. We can't do that now. More reforestation in the upper watersheds. Some of the forestry practices up in the mountains around the Okanagan Valley are not that bad in terms of following BC regulations, but nevertheless they radically transform the hydrology. The mountains above Okanagan Lake used to work like sponges. They would absorb and hold a lot of water during the springtime, and now it just goes swoosh all at once down into the lake. But the one I'm on about is the expand and restore the floodplain, which I think should be a much bigger player perhaps than it is so far in planning activities. So just a moment to talk a little bit about some literature that this particular article by Liz Kozloff, an anthropologist who's published on the idea of retreat as being an appropriate response to climate change. And she's looked particularly, in this article, a couple of case studies. One of them was Val Mayer in the Great Midwest, huge flood in Mississippi, Missouri River area in 1993, which led the whole village to actually move away from the floodplain up onto higher bluffs around it. And so that was an example, an early example of a response. That was the greatest natural disaster of this kind in the United States before Hurricane Katrina. Up until the time of Hurricane Katrina, it was a huge flood. But she focuses more on Staten Island and Hurricane Sandy 2012, which loss of life. That was really extraordinary what happened there. A lot of homes were destroyed. 44 people died on Staten Island alone. The citizens, well, they had insurance, most of them, but they didn't want to rebuild there and have it happen again. So they got together, they organized and made a request to the state governor, Como, for a buyout program. Like, let us get out of here, reclaim this land. And so where Kozloff goes is this, okay, this is a cost-effective flood mitigation under climate change regime approach. Just buy people out of these danger zones rather than spending billions of dollars on hard infrastructure. But she wants to also argue that it's a metaphor for perhaps going back to not turning the clocks back exactly, but environmentally trying to go back to a little bit more of a sustainable pattern in terms of the distribution of human populations in relationship to more natural environments, let's say. So she is pushing the idea of the environmental benefits of retreat as a general global response to climate change in a lot of different settings, coastal but also riverine. Interestingly enough, in this particular case, and she spends a lot of time in this article pointing out that, okay, Como went for it, and he provided state money as a buyout for quite a few families. But the mayor at that time of New York City, Bloomberg, who was a billionaire, who made most of his money, I believe, in the development industry, had exactly the opposite idea. He says, no way, there's no way that I will support buyouts for anybody, which meant that very few people actually were, in the end, eligible. Because his idea is, no, we're going to do hard infrastructure, we're going to develop it bigger and better than ever. Let's reclaim more. Why would we retreat? And she goes into kind of, the whole colonial history of the United States, the idea of manifest destiny, the idea that people are still really not getting their head around the fact that maybe if you made a few mistakes back when, and a different approach might be more appropriate going forward. Some interesting literature that I found just fairly recently that follows up in a similar way to Kozloff. So when I first read Kozloff's article, it was sort of like, oh, okay, that's a great idea, but it's like, duh, a lot of people have been working on this for a while. This is a study that was done of the particular, the buyout situation in the New York Hurricane Sandy. There was actually a couple of hurricanes. And they just point out how little money, relatively speaking, has been spent on buyouts and reclamation and restoration of natural flood zone areas, and recommend that we really need to expand our efforts in that particular direction. I found a study by a research institute at the University of North Carolina that's actually a manual for planners of how to do this. So this is a growing trend, I think. Qualcom Beach, right here in British Columbia, is actually heading in this direction in a coastal situation where they're in a flood zone, and they've done studies and they've said, you know what, all this hard infrastructure that we've created here over the last several decades is actually creating more problem than it is solving. It's not going to stand up to the storm surges we'll get with climate change. We need to actually dismantle a lot of this hard infrastructure and move away. And when it's not flooding, which is most of the time, we have a marvelous waterfront amenity for people to enjoy, as well as for the ecological benefits. Okay, so just looking at the BC situation, the southern interior was the main flood area in 2017. Did you get flooding here? Significant? You're on the map. You must have got something. So BC has got some responses to it that are positive, as well as the city of Kelowna. So what I wanted to close with is basically, okay, what are the benefits of restoration, and is it really likely that the city of Kelowna is going to buy into this, being a city that's been so pro-growth forever and ever? Back in the mid-'70s, early '80s, when I lived in Naramata, Kelowna was already the big, ugly, sprawly city north of us, and it was 50,000 people then. It's 130,000 now. Not to mention West Kelowna, which is also 60 or 70 or 80,000. Well, here's some of the the benefits for not of floods per se, because I mean in Papua New Guinea, where I do research, they garden in a floodplain, but only floods on, well, it's going to get worse perhaps with climate change, but it tends to flood maybe once every 10 years. Few little minor floods here and there, but it brings down all that alluvial soil, it replenishes the soil. It's very rich. It's their richest agricultural area, so they like to garden in there. I had a PhD student who did his research in Bangladesh, where people have been gardening in the Ganges and Brahmaputra floodplains for a very long time, growing rice in particular. And people know how to do agriculture in the floodplain without hard infrastructure. So floods have those kinds of benefits too, but in Kelowna we're not talking about that. We're just talking about the way in which flood zones maintain wetlands and the importance of meandering rivers in that process. So all these all these benefits that we could realize, even with relatively small restoration, percentage-wise. And here's some of the species that are either endangered or in other cases not so much endangered, but that would benefit from this kind of restoration, whose populations would become more resilient. I'm not sure if we want a lot of coyotes and cougars wandering around downtown Kelowna. I'd be good with that myself, but this is one of the areas where the citizen interest in this kind of restoration project might hit a little bit of controversy. But we could see fabulous, amazing benefits actually with just, they've demonstrated this. The mouth of the Colorado River, for instance, which could not reach the sea for decades because it was being siphoned off to Arizona, California, Los Angeles. It goes into the Pacific Ocean in Mexico. So why would the United States care? A lot of people down there at the floodplain of the Colorado who had to move away, mostly indigenous people, they finally found a way to restore enough flow that some of that water would actually go into the floodplain. And they couldn't believe the species that started coming back to life, even with just a 5 to 10% of the original flow at the mouth of that river. So people are already doing a lot about this in Kelowna. Mission Creek is not our main flood problem, but it's a problem. It's the place where the Friends of Mission Creek, society that's been around for at least a couple of decades now, have they've helped us. They spearheaded the creation of a linear park along Mission Creek to begin with, and now they're in restoring the oxbows, restoring the meanders mode, restore the fish habitat. Fish habitat, of course, is one of the big losses with what we've done to the creeks. This is the part they've done already. This is Casorso Bridge down here and Gordon, so we're kind of going towards the water down this way, kind of moved around, don't have a north-south orientation here. They've done this much, and they have the property rights and agreements to do all the rest of it, but it's hard to come up with the money. The city of Kelowna is perhaps the largest single donor, but they're not able to find the money or the willingness perhaps to find the money to do the whole thing at a speed at which these people are willing to work. They're doing a fabulous job, but they have to go cap in hand to NGOs, to the provincial government, to the city, but it's happening. It's a little more challenging with Mill Creek, because Mill Creek is not a thoroughly diked area that runs mainly through agricultural land. It's much more residential. So that's where we need to concentrate a lot more of our work of how could we do this along Mill Creek, and there are opportunities. So the City of Kelowna actually in their policy documents, there's a lot of promise, I think, in what they're suggesting in response to 2017. This is a community report, follow the 2017 flood, what are we going to do now? Yeah, okay, so protect agricultural land, renaturalize and reinforce riparian protection, more linear parks and urban creeks as detention ponds during flood events, support this restoration initiative, and their infrastructure documents indicate they're setting aside, quite a few $1 million actually to do this over the next few years. Larger setbacks for developments in flood zones, enhanced green infrastructure in flood zones. So they haven't yet committed themselves to a lot of, let's say, buyouts of properties, but they're starting to think about it. So this is where our project hopefully will come into play, and we'll be able to ally ourselves with people in the city who want to do more of this. And there certainly are people working for the city and the regional district who would really like to go very, very strongly in the direction of restoration. This goes way back to 2011. Bylaws, the city already has bylaws in place that allow them to say to developers who want to build in a flood zone, no. I'm not going to do that anymore. The groundwork has been laid to make a little more of an aggressive stance in this direction. So, conclusion, I think I'm about on time for 40 minutes. Good for me. I'm actually surprised at myself. So yeah, we have to do a lot more work, and at this point, we need to get out of our academic bunker. It's a very collaborative project. We're working with a lot of wonderful people up there, or I should say I am. But we now need to get out to talk to the folks at the city and the planning departments, and get out to the public, which we will eventually when this is an exhibition. But we need to do more studies still to determine where should we target, especially along Mill Creek, where should we target buyouts? Where could we actually get people? We're not going to be talking about expropriation, I don't think. Not yet, maybe, eventually. But we have to depend on people being willing to sell their house to the city or some level of government to remove it from the flood zone and then do some restoration work. And there is a fair willingness to do that, but of course if you end up trying to restore a wetland that has 12 houses and only 10 people agree to a buyout, what do you do with the other 2? Well, just let them flood, I suppose. Insurance companies are not going to help them, but yeah, it's not, it's a little bit of a problem. One of our members, Alex, who did the wonderful reconstruction of the Kelowna environment, has done some mapping that's potential buyouts. But he's based this so far just really on the elevation figures that he's able to get a hold of. So in other words, low elevation areas are going to be the most promising for wetland restoration, starting at the lake level and then going up. Once you get to a certain level, probably not so practical. We haven't got to the point. So he's charted certain areas that flood buyout results, values. So this is a kind of an elevational study looking at feasibility, but we haven't done the economic studies to indicate, okay, where are the properties worth the most, or where are they more affordable, where would the restoration costs to remove hard infrastructure of various kinds also be most cost effective, and et cetera. And we haven't talked to citizens about, are you willing to sell your house for the right price? I think if the price were, how do you feel about this? If the price were market value and you were looking at, because of climate change, having possible severe flooding events every year, you might be willing to, even though it's your family home, maybe. How many people live in a family home? On average, we sell our homes every 5 to 10 years, apparently. I think there's some real promise in this approach. Riparian zones, probably more amenable to restoration. Buying out those $1 million properties along the foreshore of Okanagan Lake. I'm not so sure what might happen there. So we need the cost analysis studies, and we need to understand a little bit better where the best bang for our buck will be with the ecological benefits of species and habitat restoration, ecological resilience. And then we could maybe come up with a realistic estimate of, well, how much of the original used to be all wetland could we restore? I mean, personally, I'd like to restore all of it, but that's not going to happen. But even 10% would make a phenomenal difference. And I think actually 10% is very realizable. In fact, I think 20% is probably realizable over, say, 50 years. It would be, you know, Alex Dulich, who is the leader of the Waterways Project, is one of the things she is especially skilled at is creating digital visualizations of the environment. So I'm hoping what she'll be able to do for this particular exhibition is show citizens of Kelowna what Kelowna would look like with 20% of the former wetlands restored. And you could take a virtual walk along one of the meandering river wetland areas and maybe have a coyote encounter or whatever. Okay, I think I'll end it there. Happy to have questions.
This way, we've got a number of people watching online, so I'll just wander around and hand people microphones. Thank you, sir.
So it's on. Thank you, John. That was very interesting. You mentioned about insurance companies. So they're no longer insuring these homes for flooding. Is that correct?
I'm assuming that once they're, with climate change, understanding the level of risk has increased, that they're, to begin with, they're just charging more.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking at a certain point it's going to become cost prohibitive. But I actually haven't spoken to anybody in the insurance industry to really find out exactly where that's going.
Because I think that's one area where, you know, just having the insurance companies tell you that, you know, fine, you can build your home here, but you can't get flood insurance. So you can't get fire insurance in certain parts of BC as well. And down the road, I can see them actually being a major player in persuading people not to buy homes or build homes in those areas.
I suspect you're right. Yeah, and that reinforces my sense that we really need to look at that in our research as we go forward. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Wait for the full microphone.
Maybe I'm missing the mark, or maybe it's just the cold medicine here, but seems like in the conclusions that you had there and in the City of Kelowna's plan, there's a lot going on there. It's economics, hydrology, biology, you know, social aspect. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious exactly what you guys are trying to achieve with the project and with this waterways thing. Is it in collaboration with the City of Kelowna? Are you guys trying to approach it from a group dynamic, or is this a secular thing that you guys are approaching? And what's the end goal with it here, or is it simply an exhibition to arouse awareness about the potential for restoration?
Yeah, the Waterways Project as a whole is basically designed, it was created to speak to the public. And it was created to have different publics speak to one another. We worked together, several of us on this team worked together for a previous water exhibition project called The Social Life of Water that has been actually touring the Okanagan for the last 2 years. And that was one of the ideas that informed that was to bring the different voices together, not to proselytize about what we should be doing to manage water better or differently, but to bring the Indigenous voice forward, which is one that has been less prominent in Okanagan, but also agriculture, tourism, the naturalist, the environmentalist, the average citizen. And so we had, for instance, soundtracks with extracts from interviews playing in a kind of rotation, and you could sit and just listen to different voices, literally. And so in a sense, we're trying to encourage dialogue about water and get people to work together to consider these things. But, and that's the way this project started, and that's why I got interested in the flood zone project. But having brought it this far, and having looked through the city records of to what extent is there possible buy-in, now I'm actually really excited to go and work with the city. And actually just a couple of days ago, I phoned somebody who used to work for the city, who now works for the regional district, who's also been a member of the Friends of Mission Creek Society, and knows all these issues inside out. And he's really actually excited to get together. So that's where we're going to go. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the good talk. I'm wondering, right now what you've addressed in this talk is about restoring places that have already been developed around the floodplain. If you get people out of those and you're moving, where do you move them? What's taking place at the fringes of the existing city right now? Areas that are currently floodplains or streams that have been straightened out for agriculture, something like that. What's happening to protect those? I think, is that happening in hand? I'm thinking what you're trying to do now or what this is doing now sounds great, but it sounds like the most expensive parts of property to restore, whereas there are other areas at the edges of what Kelowna is now that 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now might end up being like that. It might be a lot easier to protect and enhance what's not developed yet than the few creeks that are currently in the midst of a town. So maybe you could develop, maybe that's happening just separately, you just didn't address it yet.
That's an excellent question. Well, we've destroyed 90% of the wetlands in the valley bottom of the Okanagan. So there really is nothing left in terms of what you're suggesting that let's focus on. I mean, the university, UBC Okanagan, is actually destroying some wetland themselves right now. We are situated beside a little valley in the Glenmore area that used to be home to hundreds of pairs of American avocet migratory bird that would come and nest there every spring, summer. And now we have a little vestige, Roberts Lake, a little vestige. It's kind of a saline lake that the university actually bought that. It's surrounded by agricultural land, which they also bought from the city. And so we are actually, as a university, we're going along with the city to build roads through there. The next thing we'll be doing probably is building some houses on there for student residences or faculty housing or whatever. There's really nothing of significance left. I mean, a few little patches, yeah. But I think Mission Creek is actually surprisingly available because it's surrounded by agricultural land. There's a lot of, like, half of the city of Kelowna, the incorporated area practically is agricultural land. So it's practically, it's partly a question of what's the future of agriculture within the city. as well as what's the future of the environment within the city. But what you're suggesting about cost, this is where we need to do some hard number crunching. But if you look at Mill Creek, so for instance, Mill Creek goes past the airport. That's a hazard area for the airport. And then it floods, if it floods a golf course. Well, who cares? I don't golf. Some of you maybe golf. And then it goes through a few farmers' fields and then hits an industrial area. And then closer to the end, the last couple of kilometers, it goes through more. It actually goes through an old a little park, which is a gristmill park, kind of a cultural park more than an environmental park. And then it hits the residential areas. So when it's going through the dense residential, then you're right, you're going to hit a really high cost. But before it does that, there are lots of opportunities actually. As built up as the city of Kelowna is, and I think if you look at the cost of building hard infrastructure, dikes and culverts and things like that, we're talking about many millions of dollars, maybe billions. If you're talking about infrastructure, increased storage in the watersheds, you're talking about many millions of dollars. If you're talking about the real estate, well, real estate in Kelowna is expensive, and maybe the raw cost of X number of houses would be a little more than the X cost of hard infrastructure in that same patch of real estate. But if you add in the ecosystem benefits, then it's a no-brainer. If you actually put value on the ecosystem services that restored wetland would provide, and the flood mitigation that it would provide, then actually I think the restoration option in many of these situations that are on Alex's map is the cheapest option, and it's a win-win option because you get the environmental benefits, the other species get the benefits as well. That's my approach, and I'm sticking to it. Yeah.
My name is I'm interested in with the climate change and all that stuff that you mentioned, and you mentioned India and Bangladesh. I haven't seen that. How do we? I mean, the fact is that the climate change regime will change, and maybe insurance people will not be interested. Still, there will be people living there because it's cheap, and there will be economically vulnerable people staying there in the lowlands. So have you thought about how do we increase the resilience of community that can face the floods instead of going away from the floods? And floods per se is not a problem, right? How do we manage the floods is the problem. I mean, we can see that you have shown us how Kelowna is mismanaging the whole idea of with the reconstruction. So is there any ways that we can actually help people to increase that resiliency by reducing their vulnerabilities? Maybe there are indigenous ways of addressing this. They just live with the floods and they know how to manage the floods. For example, they have boats, or they increase their foundation levels, or they come up with some kind of gardens, or I don't know. Mm-hmm. So have you looked into that? How do we increase the community resilience so that they face floods better rather than managing them? We can never manage, I guess.
Yeah, really, it's very context specific. So if I think about the situation in Papua New Guinea, where they've been subject to flooding and how they manage it, it's actually quite easy for them to manage it. They have two different kinds of floods. They build their houses right on the beach, basically. So when they get storm surges during the wet season, they don't get monsoons there, but they get wetter weather, but stormier weather. So when the storms come in into the community, well, they build their houses up on stilts, and so normally that's no problem. The water just comes in and it goes out. You're good. Yeah, and same thing in the floodplain. If it every 10 or 15 years you get a serious flood, it wipes out your crops. Well, you have they plant their gardens in different locations. So everybody has 3 or 4 gardens going at the same time. You have them on different cycles. We're in the tropics, so things are ripen all year long. You don't just get a summer season. And so if you get flooded in the floodplain area at a higher elevation, you still have food. And so they have a variety of options, and they worked out fine. The student of mine who's from Bangladesh and who did research on what the Bangladesh government has been doing with the help of World Bank and other foreign agencies is another kind of a case. So basically you have people living in a floodplain area that they prayed for the flood every year, like, please, flood. Because when it flooded, then they'd plant the rice. And you needed the flood. You couldn't have a rice crop without it. But every once in a while, you get more than you wanted. But again, you'd have different elevation crop things going, different patterns. And also, like you say, when there was all that water, you'd get in a boat and you go fishing. So, I mean, they were very well adapted to the floodplain. These people who the student, Anwar Hussain, was describing in Bangladesh. But what the government has done with the billions of dollars of largesse from international donor agencies is try to control that flooding with a lot more hard infrastructure. And what they've done is divert rivers into irrigation channels and canals. And what happens then? What happens then is that the elites control the water in the canals, because now it's manageable, it's controllable. Local elites who own most of the land control it. There's not a very big, so to say, middle-class agricultural group in this part of Bangladesh. 90% of the population is very poor and land poor. They want to grow their own food. They don't have enough land left to grow their own food, and now they have to pay the rich folks for the water that they used to be able to get through their own ingenuity. But the real killer in this situation is that those natural flows of water used to feed wetlands, some of them ephemeral, some of them where you could go fishing or gathering wild foods, wild fruits, various other plants. You could hunt game animals. But now with the new water control system, those wetlands are gone. Those used to occupy, they used to be commons, resource commons, that are no longer available to the average person. And so people who used to be able to supplement their grown food produce from small amounts of land with commons resources now just have the little bit of land and no commons resources. They all live in Dhaka. They're living in the ghettos of Dhaka now. Yeah. So I think, I think the wetland restoration, I think, has a really wide application to a lot of settings, but it's going to be very context specific in each case, each iteration. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we've been doing. Yeah, maybe expanding the wetlands would make more homes for the homeless. I shouldn't say that out loud, but
All
okay.
right. Well, thank you very much, John, for a very interesting, exciting talk. And you'll have to come back when it's all, of course, solved.
Yeah, okay. And then we'll bring the team to Kamloops when you guys have flooding problems. And we'll solve your problems too.
Yeah, we diked everything, especially in the upper elevations. So we experienced some floods in 2017, but nothing as severe as what you experienced in the Okanagan.
Interesting. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thank you.